I've been a highway patrol officer for nearly 15 years in the state of Arizona. The vast expanse of deserted roads, cut by long straight lines and surrounded by arid desert, has always given me a feeling of solitude. At night, these roads take on an even more sinister air, as if they lead to a place beyond our world. But despite the calm, I've learned not to let the silence affect me until that night. It was a moonless night, one of those nights where the sky seemed darker than usual. I was on duty on Route 89, a road that cuts through long stretches of desert and mountains in northern Arizona. My shift had already lasted several hours, and I was driving slowly, keeping an eye on the empty road. There wasn't much traffic at that hour, just the occasional truck driver or solitary motorist. Darkness swallowed everything except for the beam of light from my patrol car's headlights, which pierced through the thick darkness ahead of me. I was about to take an exit for a quick break when I noticed, in the distance, the red taillights of a van. It was moving at a reasonable speed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I got closer, just for a routine check. That's when something unusual caught my attention. In the faint red glow of the brake lights, something was moving in the trunk of the van. I blinked, not believing what I was seeing. There, in the darkness, through the outline of the rear door, I saw what appeared to be the silhouette of a child. Small, frail figure with thin arms raised, slowly waving. My heart raced. The idea that a child could be in the trunk of a vehicle required immediate action. I turned on the flashing lights, accelerated and activated the siren to signal the driver to pull over. The van slowed down and stopped on the side of the road. The headlights pointed toward the dark desert. I quickly got out of my car, my hand resting on my belt, ready for anything. The vehicle looked old, one of those vans that had seen better days. The trunk was closed, and the rear window reflected the pale face of the driver, a woman in her 50s, who appeared calm. She rolled down the window, her expression a mix of confusion and concern, which was understandable in such a situation. I explained that I had seen something in the trunk, and she, surprised, told me there was no one else in the car besides herself. Asterisk, I asked her to step out while I checked the back with my flashlight. I opened the trunk, hoping to find some sign of a child or clue. The space was completely empty. No bags, no toys, nothing that suggested the presence of a child. My heart sank. A mix of confusion and worry overwhelmed me, sure of what I had seen. The silhouette waving at me in the darkness wasn't a figment of my imagination. I inspected the area around the van again, checking every corner, but there was absolutely nothing. I went back to talk to the driver, trying to understand what was going on. She repeated that she was alone, that she was heading home after visiting her family. However, her expression changed slightly when I mentioned the child. There was a brief moment of hesitation, as if something troubled her. But before I could ask more questions, she confirmed again that there was no one else with her. I did what was necessary, checked her papers, and let her go. She got back into the car and resumed her journey, but something inside me remained unsettled. There was something she hadn't told me, and whatever it was connected to what I had seen. I got back into my patrol car, but that feeling of unease stayed with me. The rest of the shift passed slowly, and the silence of the road became increasingly oppressive. Something wasn't right that night, and I couldn't shake the image of the child's silhouette waving from the trunk of the van. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would challenge everything I thought I knew and change my perception of reality forever. In the days following that strange encounter on the road, I couldn't stop thinking about the silhouette of the child I had seen in the trunk of the van. I tried to rationalize it, to find logical explanations. Maybe it was an illusion, caused by the headlights reflecting off something in the trunk, or perhaps my fatigue was playing tricks on me. Yet, the feeling that something deeply abnormal was at play continued to haunt me. I knew what I had seen, and the image of that child waving in the darkness of the road was far too clear to be just a hallucination. After my next shift, I returned to the station, determined to review the patrol car's camera footage. I knew all interventions were recorded, okay? And the front-facing camera might have captured something that could confirm or explain what, okay? I had witnessed something that might bring me a bit of peace. As soon as I arrived, I went to the recording control room and requested the video of the intervention with the van from that night. Watching the footage, my heart began to beat faster. The recording showed everything exactly as I remembered. It, the van in front of me, my approach, and the moment I turned on the flashing lights to stop the driver. The video clearly showed me getting out of the patrol car, approaching, and starting to talk to the driver. Up to that point, everything seemed perfectly normal. However, something unexpected happened in the recording. At the moment the van stopped, the camera captured movement in the trunk. My eyes widened. There, on the screen, for a brief instant, I saw what looked like the shadow of a small child. Okay, the silhouette was blurry due to the dim light, but unmistakable. A small, frail body, with arms raised, waving from the back of the vehicle, the same gesture I had seen that night. And then, in the blink of an eye, the shadow disappeared, as if it had never been there. My heart raced, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't my imagination. The camera had captured it. It was real, or at least something real enough to be recorded. I stared at the screen, stunned, unsure how to process what I had just seen. Even with the evidence in front of me, it was impossible to comprehend. How could I have seen something or someone who clearly wasn't there? Video continued to show the rest of the intervention. I opened the trunk, searched inside, but as I already knew, there was no trace of a child. The driver seemed uneasy, but until now, I had attributed that to the usual stress people feel when stopped by the police. Now, her expression seemed to indicate something else, as if she knew something I couldn't understand at that moment. I decided I needed to know more about this driver. Something about this situation didn't make sense, and I was determined to investigate. I returned to the station and, with the help of the intervention records, managed to identify the vehicle and the driver. Her name was Lisa Turner, a resident of a small town on the outskirts of Arizona. I checked the address and, under the pretext of following standard verification protocol, decided to visit her at home. When I arrived, the place seemed normal, a simple suburban house, nothing that indicated anything unusual. I rang the doorbell, and the woman who opened was indeed the same one I had stopped on the road. Lisa seemed surprised to see me, but her expression of confusion quickly turned into a mix of nervousness and sadness. I explained that I was there to verify some details about the intervention, without mentioning what I had seen on the recording, but I got straight to the point. I asked her if she had been alone that night. She hesitated for a moment, staring at me intensely, as if deciding what to say. That's when something unexpected happened. Lisa told me that the van she was driving the night of the intervention originally belonged to her older sister, who had recently passed away. Her sister used the van to transport her son, a 6-year-old boy named Tommy, who had also tragically died in a car accident a few months earlier. The shock of those words hit me like a ton of bricks. Kimia Child, the nephew of Lisa, who was already deceased, she started crying as she recounted how the loss of her nephew had devastated the family. The van was a painful memory, but she had decided to keep it to honor Tommy's memory. At that moment, everything began to make terrifying sense. The child I had seen in the trunk, the waving gesture, it all became clear in a disturbing way. What I had seen that night didn't belong to this world. Before leaving the house, Lisa, still in tears, mentioned that she sometimes felt Tommy was still present, as if he was somehow tied to the vehicle that he and his mother used. She couldn't explain it better, but the weight of her words confirmed what I already feared. The silhouette I had seen was the spirit of Tommy. Still waving from the trunk of the van after leaving Lisa's house, I returned to my car completely stunned. The information she had shared about her nephew Tommy seemed to reveal a reality I wasn't ready to face. The boy was dead, that was a fact. But then, how had I been able to see the silhouette of a child waving from the trunk? Even more troubling, how had the patrol car's camera captured it? My mind was confused, and the silence in the car as I drove back to the station felt suffocating. There was no logical explanation for what I had. Sign ghosts, spirits, shadows of the past. I had never believed in such things. I've always been a man of science, of concrete facts, but now something beyond logic had crossed my path, and I couldn't ignore it. Upon arriving at the station, I sat in the break room, still in shock. I replayed the events in my head, trying to piece the puzzle together. I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I found answers or at least understood what it really meant. I reviewed the video again, and for the 10th time, I watched that silhouette in the trunk. It was a clear shadow, and the movement was undeniable, a slow gesture, as if asking for help or saying goodbye. I went to see my superior and told him what I had found on the video, without mentioning the supernatural aspect that was swirling. In my mind, he seemed intrigued, but didn't give it too much importance. The camera probably picked up something in the environment, he said, a shadow or a lens defect, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The gaze of that child, if you could call it a gaze, was looking directly at me on the recording. It was a real presence, one I could feel even after watching it over and over. I decided I couldn't leave. At that, I had to return to the place where it all happened. Maybe something on that road or in the van could provide more answers. I got into my patrol car and headed back to Highway 89, feeling the weight of the dark desert all around me. Night was falling again, and the road, illuminated only by the car's headlights, seemed emptier than before. When I arrived at the exact spot where I had stopped Lisa's van the first time, I parked and turned off the engine. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle wind blowing through the desert. I got out of the vehicle, flashlight in hand, and began walking along the road, searching for a sign of Tommy, a remnant of the presence I had felt before. As I walked, the air around me seemed to grow heavier, almost oppressive. There was a sensation that I wasn't alone. A sudden chill ran down my spine, though the night was still mild. That's when, out of the corner of my eye, I perceived movement. I immediately stopped, my heart pounding in my chest, and pointed my flashlight to the side. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw the silhouette of a child running along the edge of the road toward the desert's small body, arms waving once again. My body froze, unsure whether I should follow or flee. But the silhouette disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, dissolving into the darkness like a mirage swallowed by the desert. My feet remained planted in the ground, and I took a deep breath, trying to process what I had just seen. I returned to the patrol car, but the fear didn't dissipate. I started the engine and drove slowly on the road. I think the way back to the city seemed even longer. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, and every distant headlight transformed into a silhouette on the road. Even knowing I was far from the place where it all happened, I couldn't help but glance repeatedly in the rearview mirror, hoping not to see Tommy's silhouette waving one last time as I entered the city. The light from the street lamps and urban lights brought a brief sense of relief, but something inside me had already changed forever. I knew I would never forget that night, and that, in some way, Tommy's spirit would continue to be there, trapped on that deserted road, waving to those who passed by, searching for something that would never return. In the days that followed, I talked to a few colleagues about it, without mentioning the supernatural aspect. They laughed, suggesting it was fatigue, or perhaps the loneliness of long nights on the road that had played tricks on me, but I knew I knew there was something else, something that couldn't be explained or ignored. A connection between that boy and the family's van, a link to the past that refused to disappear. I never saw Lisa's van again. Perhaps she had decided to get rid of it, or maybe she, like me, felt that keeping it close was too painful. Connection to something that no longer belonged to this world. But from time to time, while patrolling the dark and empty roads of Arizona, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror and wonder, is Tommy still there, waving to the next person who passes by? My name is Thomas Winters, and I've been a police officer for almost 8 years in Santiago, Chile. I've spent countless nights patrolling silent streets and dark alleys. But I've always managed to stay calm in strange situations. However, that night, something happened that shook my perception of reality. It was a cold winter night, typical of the capital, and the streets were almost deserted. I was on patrol with my partner, Manuel Rios, an experienced and pragmatic officer. We were assigned to the night shift, monitoring a residential area on the outskirts of Santiago, where suspicious activities had recently been reported. Nothing significant had been confirmed. So, the quiet of the night gave the impression it would be another uneventful watch until something happened. Around 3 a.m., we received a radio call. A resident had reported strange screams coming from an apparently abandoned house at the end of an isolated street. The man who called sounded visibly upset, describing the sounds as terrifying screams coming from inside the house, but with no sign of anyone nearby. We exchanged skeptical looks. No one had lived in that house for years. Some considered it cursed, a place of rumors and macabre stories circulating among former residents. But for us cops, it was just another old house. We got the exact address and headed there without delay. As we approached the house, the atmosphere began to change. The street was enveloped in a heavy, almost oppressive silence, as if the air itself was frozen. The house stood at the end of a narrow alley, its windows broken, its facade dilapidated. No lights were on around, except for the headlights of our vehicle cutting through the darkness. The surrounding land was overgrown with weeds and dead trees, giving the place an even more sinister appearance. We turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, illuminating the path with our flashlights. The house seemed abandoned for a long time. The only sound was the faint wind blowing between the trees. However, as we approached the front door, we both distinctly heard screams. Short, muffled cries, as if coming from deep inside the house. I exchanged a glance with Manuel, but there was no need for words to understand that something wasn't right. Manuel was the first to approach the door. It was slightly ajar, creaking softly when he pushed it. The smell of mold and rot was strong, mixed with something I couldn't immediately identify. We entered slowly, our flashlights sweeping the room ahead of us. The interior was in ruins, with broken furniture and debris scattered across the floor, as if some violent event had occurred there long ago. The screams had stopped. All that remained was the sound of our footsteps on the rotten wooden floor. A sense of unease settled over me, as if something invisible was watching us. We crossed the main living room, checking every corner. There was no sign of life or anything that could explain what we had heard. That's when we found what would change everything. In the center of the main room, a mark on the floor caught my attention. I approached cautiously, shining my light better on the spot. There, drawn with disturbing precision, was a circle with a pentagram in its center. The lines were traced with what looked like black ink, but the strange glow on its surface made me think of another substance. Around the circle, there were inscriptions I couldn't understand, ancient and frightening symbols, as if they were part of a macabre ritual. Manuel approached and stared at the pentagram. Neither of us knew what to say. There was no doubt that this was part of something bigger, something we couldn't explain. But aside from the circle and the inscriptions, The house was empty. There was no sign of who might have done this, and the screams we had heard earlier had simply vanished, as if they had never existed. The air inside the house was heavy, dense, as if breathing became difficult. There was a palpable sense of danger, something we couldn't identify, but felt lurking in every corner of the place. Manuel broke the silence, suggesting we should leave and call for backup. I immediately agreed. We quickly returned to the car, but before leaving, I glanced back. The house remained silent, but something inside me said we shouldn't have gone in. Something terrible had happened in that place, something beyond our understanding. Deep down, I knew all of this was far from over. As we drove away, the silence reclaimed the area, but unlike before, this silence was even more oppressive, as if something invisible was watching each of our movements, waiting for the next step. Little did we know, that night was just beginning. After this experience in the house, I tried to move on and treat the incident as another strange occurrence in a cop's career. However, something inside me had changed. The image of the pentagram and the macabre inscriptions wouldn't leave my mind. The time I closed my eyes, I saw those precise lines, the strange glow of the substance forming the design. There was something deeply abnormal about that place, something I couldn't explain, but felt in every fiber of my being. Manuel was visibly shaken too. Though he tried to hide it during subsequent patrols, he avoided talking about the subject, and whenever we approached that part of town, I could sense a slight nervousness in his voice. It was as if we both knew something unusual had happened, but we didn't want to admit it aloud. That week, we returned to the station to write up the incident report. There wasn't much to write. We had found an abandoned house, heard screams, investigated, but found no one. And of course, we mentioned the strange circle on the floor, though we avoided going into too much detail. We didn't know what to make of it. It was as if something invisible was pushing us away from the truth. It's preventing us from speaking frankly about what we had seen. The following night, during another patrol, the unease intensified. We were doing our usual rounds when Manuel, without warning, suggested returning to the house. I tried to dissuade him, saying there was no reason to go back after all we hadn't found anyone, and the place clearly seemed abandoned. But deep down, I knew he was right. Something about that house kept calling to us, and ignoring it was no longer an option. Reluctantly, I agreed. We drove in silence through the deserted streets of Santiago until we arrived at the alley. The house was there, enveloped in the night's darkness, like a sinister presence awaiting our return. It looked exactly the same as last time, perhaps even more dilapidated, as if time had advanced abnormally on it. This time, we parked the car a bit further away, sensing the tension mounting in the air. We got out of the car and moved slowly. The front door was in the same state, slightly ajar, creaking softly under the effect of the cold night wind. We entered, and the smell of rot seemed even stronger than before. The interior of the house was frozen in time, but something was different. The air was denser, heavier, as if something invisible loomed above us. We went directly to where we had found the circle, and it was still there. But this time, there was something more. The glow of the dark substance forming the pentagram seemed stronger, more vibrant, as if the mark itself pulsed with energy that didn't belong to this place. The inscriptions around it seemed to have slightly changed. The lines were sharper, as if they had been recently reinforced. Manuel knelt near the circle, canalizing the details with an intensity I had never seen in him before. He seemed fascinated, almost hypnotized by it all. While he examined the drawing, I felt a strange presence in the room, something I couldn't see but knew was there. It was the feeling of being watched, monitored by something hiding in the shadows. Suddenly, the silence of the house was broken. From deep within, coming from an invisible place, we heard a muffled noise. It wasn't a scream this time, but something far more troubling. It was as if someone was whispering a low, distant voice, speaking in a tone impossible to understand. The sound resonated against the walls, amplifying the unease that already dominated us. Manuel stood up immediately, his face now marked by confusion and fear. The whisper continued and seemed to get closer. The noise enveloped the house as if the walls themselves were whispering directly into our heads. Without exchanging a word, we knew we shouldn't be there. Something was happening, something we couldn't explain. My heart was pounding, and I signaled to Manuel that we needed to leave. He nodded quickly. We rushed back to the patrol car, the whisper still echoing in our heads, even after leaving the house. I drove fast, eager to get away from that place as soon as possible. The silence between us was heavy, full of questions. Neither of us knew how to formulate, let alone answer. That night, something changed in me. It was no longer just a matter of mystery or curiosity. What lay in that house? What hid behind that circle and its screams wasn't of this world. Felt we had crossed an invisible line, entered forbidden territory, and now something was following us, something we couldn't see. The days that followed were even more troubling. Something told me this wasn't over, and deep down, I knew we would soon be forced to return to that house to uncover the truth it held. In the days following that visit, the weight of the unknown hung over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had followed us from that night. The muffled whisper we had heard seemed to echo in my mind. The lines of the pentagram, the macabre inscriptions, and the sinister glow of the substance composing the circle invaded my thoughts every moment. Even when I tried to focus on something else, Manuel had changed too. He, who had always been the calmest and most pragmatic among us, became increasingly introspective, almost obsessed. He no longer talked about what we had seen in the house, but I caught him staring into space, as if reliving those moments mentally. He was no longer the same, and honestly, neither was I. The mystery of that house seemed to have implanted something in a sane, invisible shadow, hovering above our heads, silently observing us. Then, one night, we received another call, related to that same area. The car radio crackled around 2 a.m. this time. It wasn't just about screams. The resident who had called reported seeing strange lights inside the abandoned house. Immediately, Manuel insisted that we respond to the call. Against my instinct to avoid that place, I agreed. We arrived quickly. The house was exactly as we had left it, but the air around it seemed even denser, heavier, as if the darkness surrounding it was alive. I parked the patrol car a little further away, and before getting out, I looked at Manuel. There was a somber determination in his eyes, as if he already knew what he was about to face. We took our flashlights and weapons and moved toward the door. The wind seemed to whisper in our ears, but there was something more in that whisper, something that seemed to come from inside the house. As we approached the entrance, lights flickered inside. It wasn't a continuous light, but a kind of pulsation, as if an invisible energy was vibrating the walls. We entered cautiously. The inside of the house was different. The air, previously just heavy, now became almost suffocating. Slight mist floated on the floor, as if the environment itself was changing around us. My stomach churned from the strong smell of something burnt, mixed with rot. It was as if the stench permeated every inch of the house. Manuel led the way, heading toward the circle we had found earlier. I followed closely. We reached the room. What we saw chilled my blood. The pentagram was still there, but this time it seemed alive. The lines glowed intensely, and the dark substance forming it pulsed as if it were slowly moving, spreading across the floor. The inscriptions around it were now completely legible, though I couldn't understand their meaning. They appeared to be words from an ancient, forbidden language. The air around the circle shimmered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own, transforming into distorted, unrecognizable figures. Suddenly, the whispers returned, but this time louder. The voices came from everywhere, resonating in our heads. There were so many voices at once that it was impossible to distinguish what they were saying. It was as if the walls of the house were pressing in on us, circling us in a space no longer of this world. However, Manuel didn't seem afraid. There was something strange in his expression, as if he were in a trance. He approached the circle, eyes fixed on the pentagram, completely ignoring the whispers and what was happening around us. I shouted his name, trying to bring him back to reality, but he seemed not to hear me. Suddenly, the lights in the room began to flicker violently, and the whispers transformed into a piercing scream that seemed to tear through the air. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and the darkness around us began to close in. The shadows on the walls seemed to transform into human figures, contorted in agony, as if trapped in an eternal cycle of suffering. Manuel fell to his knees, his eyes fixed on the center of the circle, while the pentagram pulsed with even more intensity. It was as if the energy of the house was draining his life. Despair rose in me. We had to get out of there, but something was holding Manuel back, something we couldn't see. I ran toward him, trying to pull him out of the room, but his body felt as heavy as an anchor. Finally, with all my strength, I managed to drag him away from the circle. As soon as I pulled him out, the atmosphere around us seemed to change. The piercing screams ceased, and the shadows on the walls began to dissipate slowly. We ran out of the house without looking back. The cold morning air enveloped us as we crossed the gate. Manuel was pale, barely able to speak, but the trance that had overtaken him had disappeared. We got into the patrol car and left as quickly as possible, didn't exchange a word for the rest of the night. We knew that what had happened in that house couldn't be explained or understood. Something dark and ancient was at place, something that should never have been awakened since that night. Neither Manuel nor I have ever returned to that house. Honestly, I hope I never have to go back. Whatever was there wasn't human, and whatever it was, it's still there, waiting. My name is Hector Morales, and I am a police officer in the city of Mendoza, Argentina. Throughout my years of service, I have responded to countless calls from minor family disputes to more serious situations. But nothing I had experienced before could have prepared me for what happened that night. The shift was proceeding calmly, typical of a winter night with few incidents and that sense of calm that always precedes the unexpected. It was around 11 p.m. when the patrol car radio crackled, pulling me out of my relaxed state of vigilance. We received a call for a welfare check. A neighbor had reported strange noises coming from the house of an elderly woman who lived alone. The description was vague, but the tone of the voice on the radio conveyed a certain unease. The neighbor mentioned that the woman, named Dona Elvira, had lived there for decades, and that night, the sounds inside the house seemed to indicate she was in distress. I decided to respond immediately to the call. The address wasn't far, but the location itself already exuded a certain unease. The house was in a more remote area from the center, in an old neighborhood of Mendoza, surrounded by tall trees and an atmosphere frozen in time. I drove to the house, navigating narrow, poorly lit streets, feeling the silence of the night enveloping me as I made my way there. Upon arriving, the sensation that something was wrong intensified. The street was completely deserted. The streetlights flickered, casting dancing shadows on the old houses that seemed abandoned by time. Dona Alvarez's house was plunged into darkness. The rusty iron gate was slightly ajar, creaking softly, and the wind in the surrounding atmosphere was heavy, as if the air itself carried an invisible mystery. I got out of the car, took my flashlight, and headed toward the entrance. The silence was total, unsettling. No sound came from inside the house, no indication that anyone was moving or that anything was wrong at first glance. However, a growing unease began to settle over me. I approached the aged wooden door and knocked several times, hoping the elderly woman would appear. No response. I waited a moment, then knocked again, this time louder, calling her by name. Still nothing. The unease grew stronger. I decided to check if the door was unlocked, and with a slight push, it opened, creaking, slowly and eerily. The darkness inside the house was deep, almost suffocating. I turned on my flashlight and cautiously entered. The interior of the house was as old as its facade. The furniture was covered with a fine layer of dust, and the smell of mold permeated the air. It seemed the house hadn't seen a visitor in a very long time. With each step I took, the wooden floor creaked, echoing in the empty space. I called out again for Dona Elvira, but the only response was an oppressive silence. Asterisk as I moved forward. An unpleasant sensation that something terrible had happened here began to take hold. I crossed a corridor where the walls were lined with old portraits, family photos, faded by time. At the end of the corridor, I noticed a door slightly ajar. From there, a faint but unmistakable smell, stronger than the mold, reached me. It was the smell of decomposition. Trembling, I slowly pushed the door open and shone my light inside. My eyes fixed on what appeared to be the body of Dona Elvira, lying on the floor next to an old armchair. It was clear she was no longer alive. Her body was stiff in an odd position, her face frozen in an expression of despair. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I checked her pulse and confirmed the obvious: she was dead. But what intrigued me most was the scene. There were no signs of struggle or violence in the room, just the lifeless body of an elderly woman who seemed to have fallen there alone. That's when a question lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. If she was dead, who had called? The police. A growing unease settled over me. Something was very wrong, something I couldn't yet comprehend. The call had come from a neighbor, but there was no one in sight. The silence of the house seemed to conceal secrets I wasn't ready to uncover. After confirming Dona Elvira's death, doubt settled into my mind like a cold blade. If she had been dead for some time, who could have possibly called the police? The house was plunged into absolute silence, without the slightest sign of anyone being present. The smell of decomposition suggested the body had been there for a while, and the look of horror on the old woman's face only heightened my unease. The weight of the atmosphere in the house felt suffocating, as if I were being watched. The first thing I thought to do was return to the patrol car to call for backup. I needed someone to help document the scene and verify the call. But the ambient silence and the dark setting left me with the impression that something larger was unfolding. I checked the radio, confirmed the location, and requested support, hoping the presence of my colleagues would alleviate the pressure I was feeling. Then I left the room and began searching the house for clues, something that might explain what had happened. As I explored other rooms, the house gradually revealed its history. Old portraits, books covered in dust, and furniture that seemed untouched for years. I walked into the kitchen and saw an old rotary phone, one of those that seemed to belong to another era. I stared at it for a moment, the mysterious call still ringing in my head. How could someone have made that call? I swept my flashlight over the floor, trying to find traces of recent movement. Nothing. The only visible footprints in the dust were mine. The entire house seemed frozen in time, as if no one had moved here in days. There was something profoundly disconcerting about the situations, something I couldn't explain. Minutes passed, and the need for police backup became urgent. My mind tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps the neighbor had panicked for some reason. Why hadn't anyone come to check what was happening before calling the police? And why was the smell of decomposition so strong? it was clear that Donna Elvira had been dead for much longer than a few hours. That's when my mind began to entertain the impossible. There was something deeper in this scene, something that gave me the feeling of being caught in an invisible web. The old photos of the elderly woman with her family from a bygone era seemed to stare at me as if hiding secrets that should never be revealed. A shiver ran through me. The idea that the house itself harbored something sinister brushed against my mind, but it was irrational, wasn't it? After all, I had been trained to deal with facts, not superstitions. Other officers arrived, breaking the oppressive silence with their voices and flashlights. I explained what I had found and how the situation had seemed strange from the start. Together, we returned to the room where the body lay, and once again, the scene enveloped us. One of the colleagues called the coroner, who confirmed that an autopsy would be necessary as soon as possible to determine the cause and time of death. While we waited, questions continued to swirl in my mind. Who had called the police? That night, the neighbor who had made the call and then disappeared without a trace? Or was there something else in this house? The coroner arrived after some time and quickly examined the body. He, too, felt the heaviness of the air in the house. His gaze said what I already suspected. This woman had been dead for more than 24 hours. Impossible, I thought. The call had come only an hour before I arrived at the house. As the body was transported for the autopsy, the sense of mystery thickened. There was no simple answer, just the uncomfortable silence of this abandoned house. I returned to the car and reviewed the call records. Everything was in order. The call was legitimate. But despite that, the big question loomed over me like a shadow. If she had been dead for so long, who had really called the police that night? The autopsy results for Donna Elvira arrived the next day, confirming what the coroner had already suspected. She had been dead for at least 36 hours. The cause of death was a heart attack. There were no signs of violence or evidence indicating that anyone had been with her when it happened. Everything pointed to a natural death, except for one crucial detail that kept hammering in my mind. Who had called the police the previous evening? Asterisk. I spent the entire day thinking about the house, the elderly woman, and that call. Something wasn't right, but no logical explanation presented itself. I returned to the station and tried to review the details of the case. The report stated the obvious and elderly woman living alone, dead of natural causes. Yet, the mystery surrounding the phone call haunted me, preventing me from moving forward. What was even more troubling was that, despite the isolation of the house, no neighbors had come forward since the previous night to provide explanations or ask questions about the woman. The entire neighborhood seemed wrapped in a kind of complicit silence. Sitting at my desk at the station, I began to search for information about Donna Elvira's house, its history, and former residents of the street. I discovered that she had lived there since her marriage more than 50 years ago. Her husband had passed away decades earlier, and she had remained in the house alone after his death. She had no children or close relatives, and over time, she had become increasingly isolated, turning into a solitary figure in that part of the city. It seemed her death was the inevitable conclusion of a life of solitude. However, the call continued to trouble me. Over time, I began to consider theories I would normally dismiss. If Donna Elvira had been dead for so long, who or what could have made that phone call? I examined the call history to try to locate the origin of the call, but the number was unknown. It led me nowhere. My colleagues, of course, considered the case closed to natural death. For them, the mystery of the call could simply be due to confusion or an error in the system. But I couldn't accept that explanation. Days later, I decided to return to Donna Elvira's house. Something was pulling me back to that place, as if there were still unanswered questions. I went back alone, parking the patrol car on the same deserted street, enveloped by the same oppressive silence as before. I walked toward the house, which was now sealed after the expert's work. The gate still creaked, and the cold winter wind of that afternoon reinforced the sense of isolation. I stood in front of the door for a moment, as if waiting for something to reveal itself. The weight of the house felt more present, as if the structure itself held Donna Elvira's secrets. I took a deep breath and decided to walk around the property to check the surroundings. The garden was overrun with weeds, and the wall surrounding the land was high and worn. No windows seemed to have been opened in years. As I walked along the house, I felt a strange sensation, as if something was watching me. I knew I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That's when I noticed something. One of the window panes on the west side of the house was broken, though it didn't seem recent. I looked inside, illuminating the interior with the flashlight I had with me. The room was dark and empty, but I felt a presence of deep sensation that something or someone still inhabited this place, even after Donna Elvira's death. I returned to the entrance and stood there, thinking. The telephone. Something told me the old phone on the kitchen table was linked to the mystery. I went back to the station, determined to delve deeper into the history of the house, or perhaps speak to the few remaining neighbors on the street. Back at the station, I attempted something I hadn't done yet. I asked a technician to check the telephone line used by the house. When he handed me the results, my mind went blank for a few moments. He told me that the telephone line to Donna Elvira's house had been disconnected for over a year. It was impossible for any call to have been made from that house. What happened that night? Who or what made the call that led me there? At that moment, I felt a chill. The case was technically closed, but for me, finding answers was impossible. From time to time, I still passed by the street where Donna Elvira lived, casting a furtive glance at the abandoned house. Every time I think about the old phone sitting on the kitchen table, a doubt haunts me. Perhaps Donna Elvira's loneliness was so profound that even after her death, part of her spirit remained, waiting for someone to hear her final cry for help.